Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, Spirit, Self-Alienated Spirit, Culture. The truth of enlightenment. The listless movement of spirit, which no longer creates a distinction within itself, has thus entered into its own self beyond consciousness, which, on the other hand, sees itself clearly. The first moment of this clarity is determined in its necessity and conditioned by the fact that pure insight, or insight that is implicitly notion, actualizes itself. It does so when it posits otherness or determinateness within itself. In this way, it is negative pure insight. That is, a negation of the notion. This negation is equally pure, and thus there has come into being the pure thing, the absolute being, that has no further determination whatever. Characterized more precisely, pure insight qua absolute notion is a distinguishing of differences, which are no longer differences, or abstractions, or pure notion, which are no longer self-supporting, but are supported and distinguished only by the movement as a whole. This distinguishing of what contains no difference consists simply in the fact that the absolute notion makes itself into its object and posits itself as the essence over against that movement. This results in the essence being without that side wherein abstractions or differences are held apart, and therefore becomes pure thought in the form of a pure thing. This, then, is just the listless, unconscious movement to and fro within itself of spirit, to which faith was reduced when it lost a content that contained a difference. It is at the same time that movement of pure self-consciousness, for which the essence is supposed to be the absolutely alien beyond. For because this pure self-consciousness moves about in pure notions, in differences that are not differences, it collapses, in fact, into the unconscious movement to and fro of spirit, that is, into pure feeling, or pure thinghood. The self-alienated notion, for the notion here is still standing at the stage of this alienation, does not, however, recognize this identical essence of the two sides, the movement of self-consciousness and of its absolute being, does not recognize their identical essence, which is in fact their substance and enduring being. Since the notion is unconscious of this unity, absolute being has value for it only in the form of a beyond standing over against it, while the consciousness making these distinctions, and in this way having the in itself outside of it, is held to be a finite consciousness. In regard to that absolute being, enlightenment is caught up in the same internal conflict that it formerly experienced in connection with faith, and it divides itself into two parties. One party proves itself to be victorious by breaking up into two parties, for in so doing it shows that it contains within itself the principle it is attacking, and thus has rid itself of the one-sidedness in which it previously appeared. The interest which was divided between itself and the other party now falls entirely within itself, and the other party is forgotten, because that interest finds within itself the antithesis which occupies its attention. At the same time, however, it has been raised into the higher victorious element, in which it exhibits itself in a clarified form, so that the schism that arises in one of the parties, and seems to be a misfortune, demonstrates rather that party's good fortune. The pure essence itself has no difference in it. Consequently, the way in which it does obtain a difference is that two such pure essences exhibit themselves for consciousness, or there is a twofold consciousness of the essence. Pure absolute being is only in pure thought, or rather it is pure thought itself, and therefore utterly beyond the finite, beyond self-consciousness, and is only being in a negative sense. But in this way, it is just mere being, the negative of self-consciousness. As the negative of self-consciousness, it is also related to it. It is an external being, which related to self-consciousness, within which differences and determinations fall, receives within it the difference of being tasted, seen, etc., and the relationship is that of sense certainty and perception. If we start from this sensuous being, into which that negative beyond necessarily passes, but abstract from the specific ways in which consciousness is related to it, then what remains is pure matter as a listless, aimless movement to and fro within itself. In this connection, it is important to bear in mind that pure matter is merely what is left over when we abstract from seeing, feeling, tasting, etc. That is, it is not matter that is seen, tasted, felt, etc. What is seen, felt, tasted is not matter, but colour, a stone, a salt, etc. Matter is rather a pure abstraction, and so what we are presented with here is the pure essence of thought, or pure thought itself as the absolute, which contains no differences, is indeterminate, and devoid of predicates. I wouldn't mind playing with headers right now. Anyway, to continue. I can't remember what the game's called. It's some French game, similar to Jack's, and the artist is Chardin. One party of the Enlightenment calls absolute being that predicates absolute which exists in thought beyond the actual consciousness, which formed the starting point. The other calls it matter. If these were to be distinguished as nature and spirit, or God, then the unconscious and aimless inner movement, to and fro, would lack the wealth of developed life, which would make it nature, and the self-differentiated consciousness, which would make it spirit or God. The two, as we saw, are absolutely the same notion. The difference lies not in what they actually are, but simply and solely in the different starting points of the two developments, and in the fact that each sticks to its own point in the movement of thought. If they could disregard their own starting points, they would meet and would recognize that what to the one is, so it pretends, an abomination, and to the other a folly, is the same thing. For to the one absolute being is in its pure thinking, or is immediately for pure consciousness, is outside finite consciousness, the negative beyond of it. If it would reflect firstly that the single immediacy of thought is nothing else but pure being, and secondly, that what is negative for consciousness is at the same time related to it, that in the negative judgment the is copula holds together as well as separates the terms. It would come to see that this beyond, characterized as something existing externally, stands in a relation to consciousness and is thus the same as what is called pure matter. The missing moment of presence would be gained. The other enlightenment starts from sensuous being, then abstracts from the sensuous relation of tasting, seeing, etc., and makes that being into a pure in itself, into an absolute matter, into what is neither felt nor tasted. This being has in this way become something simple, without predicates, the essence of pure consciousness. It is the pure notion as implicitly existent, or pure thought within itself. This insight does not consciously take the reverse step from what simply is, to what is thought, which is the same as what simply is, does not take the step from the pure positive to the pure negative, although after all the positive is pure solely through negation, while the pure negative, as pure, is in its own self-identical, and just for that reason positive. Or again, they have not arrived at the notion found in Descartes' metaphysics, that being and thought are in themselves the same. They have not arrived at the thought that pure being, is not something concretely real, but a pure abstraction, and conversely, pure thought, self-identity, or essence, partly is the negative of self-consciousness, and therefore a being, partly as immediately simple, is likewise nothing else but being. Thought is thinghood, or thinghood is thought. Essence here is split into two in such a way that, to begin with, two different ways of considering it are involved. In part, essence must contain difference within itself. In part, just because of this, the two ways of considering it merge into one, for the abstract moments of pure being and the negative by which they are distinguished are then united in the object we so considered. The universal, common to both, is the abstraction of a pure inward oscillation, or of a pure self-thinking. This simple notary motion must become more complex, because it is itself only motion by distinguishing its moments. This distinguishing of the moments leaves their unmoved unity behind as the empty husk of pure being, which is no longer actual thought, no longer has any life within it, for this process of differentiation is, qua difference, all the content. This process, however, which places itself outside of that unity, is an alternation. An alternation which does not return into itself, of being for another, and of being for self. It is reality in the way this is an object for the actual consciousness of pure insight. Utility. But as utility may look to faith or sentimentality, or even to the abstract thought that calls itself speculation, which clings to the in itself, yet it is in utility that pure insight achieves its relation and has itself for its object, an object which it now no longer repudiates, and which too no longer has for it the value of a void, or of the void, or the pure beyond. For pure insight is, as we saw, the existent notion itself, or pure self-identical personality distinguishing itself within itself in such a way that each of the distinguished moments in itself, pure notion, that is at the same time not distinguished. Pure insight is simple, pure self-consciousness which is for itself, as well as in itself, in an immediate unity. Its being in itself is therefore not an enduring being, but in its difference immediately ceases to be something. Such a being, however, that is immediately without support is not an intrinsic being, but is essentially for another, which is the power that absorbs it. But this second moment, which is opposed to the first, to the being in itself, equally vanishes immediately, like the first, or as a being which is only for another. It is rather the vanishing itself, and there is posited the accomplished return into itself, being for self. This simple being for self, however, as self-identity, is rather a mere being, or is thereby for another. This nature of pure insight, in the unfolding of its moments, or insight qua object, is expressed in the useful. What is useful is something with an enduring being in itself, or a thing. This being in itself is at the same time only a pure moment, hence it is absolutely for another, but equally is for another merely what it is in itself. These opposed moments have returned into the indivisible unity of being for self. While the useful does express the notion of pure insight, it is not pure insight as such, but insight conceived by it in the form of object. It is merely the restless alternation of these moments, of which one indeed is itself, the accomplished return into itself, but only as being for self, that is, as an abstract moment appearing on one side over against the others. The useful itself is not a negative essence, having in itself these moments in their antithesis, and at the same time as undivided in one and in the same respect, or as thought, as they are qua pure insight. The moment of being for self is certainly present in the useful, but not in such a way that it overarches the other moments. the in itself and the being for another, in which case it would be the self. Pure insight has therefore in the useful its own notion, in its pure moments for object. It is the awareness of this metaphysics, but not as yet the comprehension of it. Consciousness has not yet reached the unity of being and notion itself, since the useful still has the form of an object for pure insight. It does have a world, one which, it is true, is no longer in and for itself, but yet a world which is distinguishes from itself. Only since the antitheses have emerged at the summit of the notion, the next stage will see them, will see them come into collision, and the Enlightenment will taste the fruits of its deeds. Looking at the object obtained in relation to this whole sphere, we see that the actual world of culture was summed up in the vanity of self-consciousness into a being for self, whose content is still that confused world of culture, and which is still the single individual notion, not yet the explicitly universal notion. But returned into itself, that notion is pure insight, pure consciousness as pure self or negativity, just as faith is precisely the same as pure thought or positivity, in that the self, faith has the moment that makes it complete, but perishing through being thus completed. It is in pure insight that we now see the two moments as absolute being, which is simply thought or the negative, and as matter, which has positive being. This completeness still lacks that actual world of self-consciousness, which belongs to the vain consciousness, the world out of which thought raised itself to itself. What is thus lacking is obtained in utility insofar as pure insight there acquires positive objectivity, now constitutes its world. It has become the truth of the entire preceding world, of the ideal, as well as of the real world. The first world of spirit is the widespread realm of its self-dispersed existence, and of the self-certainty of its individual forms. Just as nature disperses its life into infinitely various forms, without the genus of those forms having an actual existence. The second world contains the genus and is the realm of intrinsic being, or truth, over against that certainty. The third world, however, that of the useful, is the truth which is equally the certainty of itself. The realm of the truth of faith lacks the principle of actuality, or the certainty of self as this particular individual, but the actuality or the certainty of self as this particular individual lacks intrinsic being. In the object of pure insight, both worlds are united. The useful is the object insofar as self-consciousness penetrates it, and has in it the certainty of its individual self, its enjoyment, its being for self. Self-consciousness sees right into the object, and this insight contains the true essence of the object, which is to be something that is penetrated by consciousness, or to be for another. This insight is thus itself true knowing, and self-consciousness has equally directly the universal certainty of itself. It's pure consciousness. In this relationship, in which, therefore, truth, as well as presence and actuality are united. The two worlds are reconciled, and heaven is transplanted to earth below.